The affluent suburbs of Silicon Valley always looked like a perfectly curated magazine spread at midnight, the manicured lawns bathed in the silver light of street lamps. But inside the master bedroom of a multi-million-dollar estate, a single notification on a silent smartphone was about to reduce a decade-long marriage to ash. The screen illuminated a high-resolution photo of a familiar woman kissing a stranger outside a coastal hotel, exposing a life built entirely on a foundation of lies. If stories of fragile loyalties, deep scars, and beautiful ruins captivate you, stay with me. There are so many more secrets behind these closed doors waiting to be uncovered. The central air conditioning of the house hummed a low, steady note, masking the sound of Raj Sharma's shallow breathing. He stood in the doorway of the master bedroom, the heavy oak frame cool against his shoulder. Moonlight bled through the plantation shutters, casting thin, prison-like shadows across the California king bed. Beneath the expensive linen duvet, his wife, Stephanie, was asleep. Her chest rose and fell in a perfectly serene rhythm. Raj's thumb hovered over the screen of his phone. The device felt like a lead weight in his palm, radiating a toxic, blue glare in the dark room. He was a corporate attorney, a man whose entire career was built on dissecting contracts, finding loopholes, and anticipating betrayal before it happened. Yet he hadn't seen this coming. 30 minutes ago, an anonymous email had bypassed his spam filter. The subject line was empty. The contents were not. He looked down at the screen one last time. There was a high-resolution, time-stamped photograph of a sleek black Porsche idling under the harsh fluorescent lights of a Metro gas station off Interstate 10. Stephanie was leaning into the passenger window, her hand resting intimately on the driver's neck. The second attachment was a forwarded confirmation email for a weekend suite at the Seaside Inn, a coastal hotel 2 hours north. The name on the reservation was Brett Gold, Brett, a charismatic venture capitalist Raj had shaken hands with just last month at a Silicon Valley fundraiser. A man married to Camille Beaumont, an elegant woman Raj knew only through brief, polite exchanges over champagne. All the late nights Stephanie claimed her PR firm was in crisis mode. All of a sudden, defensive arguments about needing space, the cold distance that had crept into their bed over the last 2 years. It all instantly crystallized into a perfect, devastating logic. Raj didn't feel the sudden, explosive rage he had always imagined an agonizing betrayal would bring. Instead, he felt a slow, creeping paralysis. His heart beat with a terrifying, hollow thud. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. He didn't scream her name or throw the phone against the wall. Waking her up meant giving her a chance to speak, to cry, to fabricate a pathetic web of excuses. He refused to give her that power. Raj turned away from the bed. His footsteps were silent on the thick carpet as he walked down the hall to the guest room. From the top shelf of the closet, he pulled down a worn leather duffel bag. He packed with methodical, almost robotic efficiency, 3 suits, casual shirts, his passport, and a vintage watch he kept in a velvet box. He left behind his wedding band, placing it deliberately on the cold marble of the bathroom sink, right next to her expensive face creams. As he walked out the front door, the sheer, crushing weight of his reality threatened to buckle his knees. He was leaving the life he had bled to build. But as he slid into his car and pushed the ignition button, the quiet roar of the engine anchored him. He backed out of the driveway, his headlights sweeping across the manicured, sleeping neighborhood. Stephanie would wake up to a silent, empty house. The absence of his things would be a far louder, more terrifying message than any screaming match could ever be. But Raj wasn't just driving away into the night. His mind had already pivoted from the wreckage of his marriage to a new, razor-sharp objective. Brett Gold had a wife, a proud, intelligent woman who was currently living in a carefully constructed lie. Raj merged onto the empty freeway, the digital clock on the dashboard reading 2:14 a.m. He was going to find Camille Beaumont. The harsh fluorescent canopy of the Metro gas station buzzed with a low, mechanical hum, casting an unforgiving, sterile light over the empty concrete lot. The smell of high-octane fuel mixed unpleasantly with the crisp, salt-tinged night air of the Bay Area. At pump number 4, Camille Beaumont stood perfectly straight, the collar of her camel-colored cashmere coat pulled tight against the chill. Underneath, the hem of silk pajamas brushed against her designer loafers. It was nearly 3 in the morning. a time reserved for insomniacs, long-haul truckers, and women trying to outdrive the suffocating silence of a sprawling, empty mansion. Brett had told her he was at a weekend-long venture capital retreat in Carmel. Camille had stopped asking for details years ago. Their marriage had seamlessly transitioned from a passionate partnership into a polite, well-funded corporate merger. Still, the phantom weight of his absence always left her restless. She watched the digital numbers on the pump tick upward, her mind 1,000 miles away, until the low crunch of tires on gravel snapped her attention back to the present. A dark gray Audi pulled into the space opposite hers. The engine cut off. For a fleeting second, a spike of anxiety shot through Camille's chest. A woman alone at a gas station in the dead of night was always a vulnerable target. She instinctively tightened her grip on her keys. The driver's side door opened. A man stepped out. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, though the tie was missing and the top button of his shirt was undone. He didn't look dangerous. He looked profoundly exhausted, carrying the heavy, hollowed-out posture of a man who had just survived a terrible accident. He didn't walk toward the convenience store. He walked deliberately toward her. "Mrs. Beaumont," he said. His voice was low, remarkably steady, cutting through the ambient hum of the freeway in the distance. Camille's guard instantly went up, her posture rigid. "Do I know you? We met briefly last winter. At the Silicon Valley Children's Fund Gala," he replied, stopping a polite distance away. He kept his hands visible at his sides. "My name is Raj Sharma. My wife is Stephanie Moore." Camille blinked, her sharp mind quickly filtering through social Rolodexes. Stephanie Moore, the aggressive, blonde public relations executive. "Mr. Sharma, this is an unorthodox time for a reunion. If you're lost, the freeway on-ramp is just—" "Brett isn't in Carmel," Raj interrupted. He didn't raise his voice, but the absolute certainty in his tone made the words strike like a physical blow. Camille froze. The automatic nozzle clicked, signaling her tank was full, but she didn't move to remove it. "Excuse me?" Raj reached into his inner jacket pocket and withdrew his smartphone. He tapped the screen once to wake it up, bypassing the lock screen, and held it out toward her. The display was agonizingly bright in the dim surroundings. "I left my house an hour ago," Raj said, his eyes fixed on her face. "I thought you had the right to know why your husband's phone is likely going straight to voicemail." Camille hesitated. Every instinct bred into her by her wealthy, image-conscious upbringing screamed at her to turn away, to get into her car, to ignore the madman in the parking lot. But the terrifying calm in Raj's eyes anchored her feet to the concrete. Slowly, she looked down at the screen. It was the high-resolution photograph of the sleek black Porsche, taken outside the Seaside Inn. The timestamp was clear, the license plate was undeniable, and the woman leaning through the passenger window, her hand buried in Brett's hair, was Stephanie Moore. Camille didn't scream. Women of her pedigree were taught never to make a scene, but Raj watched as the elegant, carefully constructed facade of Camille Beaumont shattered into a million invisible pieces. All the color drained from her face, leaving her skin as pale as porcelain. Her breathing hitched, a sharp, ragged intake of air that sounded like tearing silk. She stared at the digital image for what felt like an eternity, the reality of a decade-long marriage unraveling before her very eyes under the sickly glow of a gas station canopy. When she finally looked back up at Raj, the polite, aristocratic woman was gone. In her place was someone entirely different, someone standing at the edge of the exact same abyss he was in. "Where are they?" Camille whispered, her voice trembling with a newly born, icy rage. The neon sign of the highway diner buzzed with a defect, its flickering red light bleeding through the rain-streaked window and casting long, bruised shadows across the vinyl booth. It was a place that smelled permanently of scorched coffee and industrial bleach, a place where nobody from Silicon Valley's elite would ever accidentally walk in. Camille sat rigid against the cracked upholstery, her dark trench coat remaining perfectly buttoned. Before her sat a mug of black coffee that had long since gone cold, a thin, iridescent film of oil resting on its surface. When the bell above the glass door chimed, she didn't flinch. She simply watched Raj Sharma navigate the narrow aisle, noting how the heavy lines of exhaustion around his eyes had deepened since their encounter at the gas station 24 hours ago. He slid into the booth opposite her. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the clatter of silverware from the kitchen and the relentless drumming of the coastal rain against the glass. "His toll transponder," Camille finally said, her voice dropping the aristocratic, polite cadence it usually carried. It was flat, hollowed out. "It registered crossing the San Mateo Bridge at 6 o'clock on Friday evening. Carmel is entirely in the opposite direction. He also made a cash withdrawal of $3,000 on Thursday." Raj nodded slowly. He didn't offer empty sympathies. He knew better than to offer a woman like Camille Beaumont pity. "Stephanie told me she had a crisis management retreat in Napa. I checked the mileage on her SUV this morning before I went to the office. She drove exactly 214 miles, the exact round trip to the Seaside Inn." Camille looked down at her manicured hands, resting gracefully on the cheap Formica table. Her wedding band, a 3-carat emerald-cut diamond, caught the harsh overhead light. "I spent the entire day imagining the conversation," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the stone. "I imagined throwing his clothes onto the driveway. I imagined the look on his face when he realized I knew." She looked up, and the vulnerability in her eyes had frozen over into something sharp and dangerous. "But if I file for divorce tomorrow, he will hire the best litigators in the state. He will spin the narrative. I will become the neglected, paranoid wife, and he will protect his assets. He will also keep his reputation," Raj added, his legal mind instinctively aligning with her cold logic. "Stephanie's entire career is built on optics. If I walk away now, she gets a clean break, a quiet settlement. In 6 months, they will debut as a couple, claiming they met after their tragic respective divorces. They get to keep their lives. We just get to be collateral damage." Camille's jaw tightened. The thought of Brett smiling for society photographers with Stephanie Moore, while she was quietly relegated to the status of a starter wife, was more offensive than the infidelity itself. "So, what are you proposing, Mr. Sharma? We simply go home and ask them how their weekends were?" "Yes," Raj said, leaning forward slightly, the diner's red neon reflecting in his dark eyes. "We go back. We smile. We ask them about the traffic. We pour their wine." Camille let out a breath that was half scoff, half sigh. The psychological toll of what he was suggesting was monumental. To lie beside the man who had hollowed out her life, to feign ignorance while he texted another woman from their bathroom. It was a terrifying form of self-mutilation. "We gather everything," Raj continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Offshore accounts, hidden equity, burner phones. We don't just leave them, Camille. We dismantle them. We take the very things they are trying to protect by lying to us." The silence settled between them again, heavier this time, thick with the weight of an unspoken conspiracy. They were no longer just a betrayed husband and a humiliated wife. They were architects standing before a controlled demolition. Camille slowly reached across the scarred table, bypassing the cold coffee, and offered her hand. Raj took it. The handshake was brief, devoid of warmth, but absolute in its conviction. The pact was sealed in the suffocating quiet of the diner, binding two strangers together in the dark, ruinous pursuit of absolute vengeance. The absolute hardest part of the war was the morning routine. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Raj's kitchen, casting a warm, deceptive glow over the white marble island. Stephanie stood near the espresso machine, her blonde hair pinned back, effortlessly chic in her silk blouse and tailored trousers. She was frothing oat milk for her morning latte, animatedly complaining about a demanding client at her PR firm. She smelled of Le Labo perfume and casual, practiced deception. Raj sat on the bar stool opposite her, a ceramic mug held between his hands. He nodded at the right intervals, offering sympathetic murmurs. His face was a mask of placid exhaustion, the standard expression of an overworked corporate attorney. But beneath the surface, his mind was cold and clinical. He wasn't looking at his wife anymore. He was observing a hostile witness. Just an hour prior, while Stephanie was in the shower, Raj had accessed their shared cellular plan's detailed billing matrix. He had spent 20 minutes cross-referencing timestamps. Amidst the hundreds of calls to journalists and clients, there was a ghost pattern, a recurring, unassigned local number. The calls were always brief, never lasting more than 2 minutes, and almost exclusively placed during her commute or late at night when Raj was supposedly asleep in the guest room. The digital breadcrumbs were small, but to a man trained to find discrepancies in 100-page contracts, they were glaring beacons. "Are you even listening to me, Raj?" Stephanie paused, the milk frother whirring to a halt. She looked at him, a flicker of genuine annoyance in her blue eyes. "I am," Raj said, his voice perfectly even. "The tech startup is pushing back on the press release. I think you should hold your ground." Her expression softened, the annoyance melting into the familiar, patronizing affection she had adopted over the last year. "Exactly. Thank you. I feel like I'm carrying the weight of the whole firm lately. I might need a spa weekend soon just to decompress." "You should," Raj replied, taking a slow sip of his black coffee. The dark, bitter liquid burned the back of his throat. "You've earned it." 12 miles away, in the cavernous silence of an Atherton estate, Camille Beaumont was conducting a financial autopsy. Brett had left for a breakfast meeting at the Menlo Park Country Club, leaving his heavy mahogany study unlocked. It was a rare oversight, born of the arrogant comfort of a man who believed his wife was entirely docile. Camille sat at his expansive desk, the soft hum of his desktop computer, the only sound in the room. Her hands, usually perfectly manicured and steady, trembled slightly as she inserted a small, encrypted flash drive into the port. She didn't need to guess his passwords. She had subtly installed a keylogger software on his machine 2 days after her meeting with Raj. As the hidden files decrypted on the screen, Camille felt the air thin in her lungs. Brett wasn't just careless. He was ruthlessly organized. She found a separate ledger, masked as consulting fees for a defunct LLC. The routing numbers traced back to a secondary, offshore account she had never seen. And there, buried in the monthly statements, were the recurring, exorbitant charges. The Seaside Inn, fine dining, luxury car rentals, high-end jewelers in Carmel. It wasn't just a fling, it was an entirely parallel life, funded by the wealth she had helped him build. She scrolled down, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her cold, tearless eyes. Every line item was a knife twisting in her ribs, a precise measurement of how little she meant to him. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from an unsaved number, a burner phone she had purchased with cash at a pharmacy. "Pattern confirmed. It goes back further than we thought. Check your email." Camille stared at Raj's message. She took a slow, deep breath, closing her eyes as the faint scent of Brett's expensive cologne lingered in the study. The shock was finally fading, replaced entirely by a freezing, suffocating clarity. They were gathering the ammunition, and the arsenal was vast. She ejected the flash drive, shut down the computer, and walked out of the study, leaving the door cracked exactly the way she had found it. The sabotage began not with an explosion, but with a series of quiet, invisible fractures. On Tuesday morning, Camille sat in the sunlit solarium of her Atherton home, sipping a cup of Earl Grey tea. On her lap rested a sleek silver laptop. Over the past 4 days, she had mapped out the intricate web of Brett's finances. He was a smart man, but his arrogance was his fatal flaw. He had forgotten that, 7 years ago, during a brief health scare, he had granted Camille a sweeping, durable power of attorney over his primary holding company, the very company that acted as the parent umbrella for his hidden offshore LLC. Camille picked up her phone and dialed the international number for the compliance division of the Cayman-based private bank. When the representative answered, her voice was the perfect auditory illusion of a wealthy, slightly anxious wife managing her husband's affairs. She requested a mandatory comprehensive security audit on the offshore ledger, citing a suspicious domestic login attempt she had supposedly noticed on their shared home network. She provided all the correct authorization codes. "As a precaution, Mrs. Beaumont, this will temporarily freeze all outbound transfers and halt credit authorizations linked to this account for a minimum of 14 business days pending review," the compliance officer warned, his tone deferential. "I understand," Camille replied smoothly, watching a hummingbird hover outside the glass. "My husband's financial security is our highest priority. Better safe than sorry." The call ended. In less than 5 minutes, the bottomless well of money Brett used to fund his illicit coastal getaways, the luxury car rentals, and the diamond bracelets was effectively sealed shut behind a wall of international banking bureaucracy. Meanwhile, 40 miles north in a private dining room at a high-end San Francisco sushi restaurant, Raj was slowly tightening a different kind of noose. He sat across from Marcus Vance, the CEO of a prominent tech startup preparing for a highly anticipated IPO. Marcus was also the crown jewel of Stephanie's public relations firm. If she lost Marcus, her firm would hemorrhage credibility. "Stephanie is a miracle worker," Marcus said, raising his glass of sake. The press strategy she pitched last week was flawless. You're a lucky man, Raj. Raj offered a practiced, weary smile. He swirled the amber liquid in his own glass, letting a heavy, calculated silence stretch across the table. He looked down, as if debating whether to share a private burden. She is brilliant, Marcus, Raj finally said, keeping his voice low and confidential. But, just between us, as friends, I'd ask you to keep a close eye on the IPO rollout. Marcus lowered his glass, the cheerful demeanor instantly replaced by the sharp, paranoid instincts of a tech founder. What do you mean? Is something wrong at the firm? Not the firm, Raj lied effortlessly. Just personal matters. Stephanie has been heavily distracted lately, taking off on random weekend retreats, missing calls. She's burning the candle at both ends, and I'm worried she's overextended herself. I just wouldn't want your launch to suffer if she drops the ball. He didn't accuse her of anything explicitly. He didn't need to. In the ruthless ecosystem of Silicon Valley, the mere suggestion of instability was enough to trigger a panic. Raj watched as the seed of doubt took immediate root in Marcus's eyes. The CEO nodded slowly, his mind already calculating contingencies, already preparing to pull his account at the first sign of a missed deadline. An hour later, Raj sat in his corner office overlooking the financial district. He pulled the prepaid burner phone from his briefcase and typed a single, brief message. Oxygen restricted. A minute later, the screen lit up with Camille's reply. Accounts frozen. Raj leaned back in his leather chair and closed his eyes. The trap was set. The walls were closing in, and neither Brett nor Stephanie had any idea they were already suffocating. Room 114 of the Vista Motor Lodge smelled faintly of stale tobacco and cheap industrial pine cleaner. It was a space designed for transients and truck drivers, miles away from the manicured lawns of Atherton and the glass skyscrapers of the financial district. For Raj and Camille, the anonymity of the sagging mattress and the flickering fluorescent vanity light was the only safe haven they had left. Raj stood by the faux wood laminate table, arranging a series of printed bank statements under the dim glow of a plastic desk lamp. He had taken off his suit jacket and loosened his tie, the armor of his corporate life discarded in the suffocating heat of the poorly ventilated room. A few feet away, Camille sat on the edge of the bed. She had slipped off her designer heels, her stockinged feet resting on the thin, patterned carpet. She stared blankly at the wall, listening to the rhythmic, rattling hum of the window air conditioning unit. Brett spent 3 hours on the phone with the Cayman branch this morning, Camille said softly, breaking the heavy silence. Her voice was devoid of triumph, carrying only a bone-deep exhaustion. He was pacing the library, screaming at a compliance officer. He told me it was a minor tax issue with a legacy client. He lied without breaking eye contact. Raj paused, his hand hovering over a highlighted row of numbers. Stephanie canceled her supposed solo wellness retreat for this weekend. Marcus demanded a full, in-person audit of her PR strategy for the IPO. She was stress-crying in the bathroom before she left for the office. They had done it. They had drawn the first blood, executing their sabotage flawlessly without leaving a single fingerprint. Yet sitting in the dismal motel room, neither felt the vindication they had anticipated. The adrenaline of the offensive had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow reality. Raj looked at Camille. The harsh overhead lighting cast long shadows under her cheekbones, emphasizing the fragility she usually kept hidden behind her aristocratic poise. She looked incredibly small sitting on the edge of the cheap bed, a woman whose entire universe had been violently upended. He walked over to the mini-fridge, pulled out a generic bottle of water, and moved to sit on the mattress beside her. He kept a respectful distance, the springs groaning slightly under his weight. He held the cold bottle out to her. Camille reached for it. As she took the plastic cylinder, her fingers brushed against his. It was a microsecond of contact, a fleeting friction of skin against skin. But in a life that had suddenly become entirely devoid of genuine affection, the touch felt like a physical shock. Neither of them pulled away immediately. Camille's hand lingered against his, the icy condensation from the bottle melting between their fingers. She slowly lifted her eyes to meet his. The distance between them suddenly felt suffocatingly narrow. "Do you realize what we're doing?" Camille whispered, her gaze dropping to where their hands were still touching. "We are sitting in a cheap, anonymous motel room. We have burner phones. We are lying to our spouses about where we are." The bitter irony hung in the stale air. In their desperate pursuit of justice, they had perfectly mirrored the clandestine mechanics of an affair. They were becoming the secret. Raj didn't move away. Instead, he slowly turned his hand, allowing his fingertips to lightly trace the ridge of her knuckles. It wasn't a gesture of lust. It was a profound, desperate acknowledgement of their shared damnation. "We aren't them, Camille," Raj said, his voice dropping to a low, raw register. "We are just surviving." "Are we?" she breathed, leaning in a fraction of an inch closer, the scent of her expensive perfume mixed with the metallic smell of the air conditioner. "Because right now, the only time I feel like I can actually breathe is when I'm in this awful room with you." The boundary had been breached. They didn't kiss, held back by the crushing weight of their mutual guilt, but the line between allies and something far more dangerous had irrevocably blurred. As the neon sign from the highway buzzed outside their window, casting red shadows across the bed, Raj knew that the war they were waging was no longer just about destroying Brett and Stephanie. It was about what would be left of the two of them when the ashes finally settled. The lobby of the seaside inn smelled of eucalyptus, polished mahogany, and old money. High windows framed the crashing Pacific waves, but Brett Gold wasn't looking at the view. He stood at the reception desk, his custom-tailored linen jacket draped casually over one arm. A few feet away, Stephanie Moore pretended to admire a local artist's abstract painting, though she was discreetly checking her reflection in the glass. It was Friday evening. They had successfully navigated another week of lies, and this weekend was their reward. "Reservation for Gold," Brett said, offering the concierge a charismatic, practiced smile. The young man in the immaculate uniform typed into his terminal. "Ah, yes. Mr. Gold, the Ocean Suite. We just need a card for the incidentals." Brett reached into his leather wallet, bypassing his joint accounts with Camille, and pulled out the sleek, heavy titanium card linked to his hidden offshore LLC. He slid it across the marble counter. The concierge swiped it. The machine beeped, a sharp, unyielding electronic rejection. A faint crease appeared between the young man's brows. He tried the chip reader. The terminal flashed red again. "I apologize, Mr. Gold," the concierge murmured, leaning in slightly to maintain discretion. "It appears the card has been declined." "A security hold, perhaps?" Brett's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of arrogant irritation. "That's impossible. Try it again." "I have, sir. 3 times. Do you have an alternative form of payment?" Behind Brett, a wealthy older couple waiting in line exchanged a quiet, judgmental glance. The back of Brett's neck grew hot. He pulled out another card, a secondary business account. He handed it over with a rigid jaw, swiped, declined. Panic, cold and sharp, began to pool in Brett's stomach. The financial fortress he had built to protect his double life was suddenly, inexplicably locked from the inside. Before he could demand to speak to a manager, a shrill ring pierced the quiet elegance of the lobby. It was Stephanie's phone. She answered it, her tone shifting into her bright, professional PR voice. "Marcus, I thought we agreed we were holding all calls until—" She stopped. The blood drained entirely from her face. Even from the desk, Brett could hear the muffled, furious shouting coming from the earpiece. Marcus Vance, her firm's most critical client, was screaming. He wasn't just pulling his IPO account. He was threatening a public statement regarding her firm's negligence. He had called her office, only to be told by a panicking junior associate that Stephanie was completely unreachable on a supposed wellness retreat. "Marcus, please, listen to me. I'm at the retreat right now. I can step away." Stephanie stammered, her voice trembling, drawing the attention of everyone in the lobby. "You're standing in the lobby of the Seaside Inn, Stephanie," the voice on the phone roared, echoing slightly. "My CFO is having a drink at the bar right behind you." Stephanie whipped around, sitting at the mahogany bar, holding a martini, and looking at her with absolute disgust, was the chief financial officer of Marcus's tech startup. Her alibi didn't just crack, it shattered into dust in front of an audience. 60 miles away, Raj and Camille sat in the front seats of Raj's parked Audi, overlooking the darkened waters of the bay. The silence in the cabin was profound. The screen of Camille's burner phone lit up in the cup holder. Automated alert. 4 declined authorization attempts at Seaside Inn Ka. A moment later, Raj's phone buzzed. It was a brief, coded text from a colleague in the financial district. "Vance just fired her firm. It's a total massacre." Raj locked his phone and set it face down on the console. He looked over at Camille. She was staring out the window at the black water, her face illuminated only by the faint glow of the dashboard. They had orchestrated a flawless, synchronized demolition. Brett was currently standing at a hotel desk with no access to his hidden wealth, while Stephanie's career imploded in real time. They had won. The trap had worked perfectly. But as Raj watched a single, silent tear slip down Camille's cheek, catching the dim light before disappearing into the collar of her coat, he realized the terrifying truth. Destroying the people who had broken them didn't put the pieces of their own lives back together. It only left them standing in the wreckage. The private viewing room in the subterranean level of the First Republic branch in downtown San Francisco was designed for absolute discretion. There were no windows, only the soft, clinical hum of the ventilation system and the muted, even glow of recessed ceiling lights. Camille stood at the polished mahogany table, her camel coat draped over a leather chair. She possessed the long brass key, found taped to the underside of a heavy drawer in Brett's Atherton study, and the sweeping power of attorney required to bypass the bank manager's polite hesitation. Raj stood near the heavy steel door, his posture rigid. They had expected to find bearer bonds, the deed to a hidden coastal property, or physical stock certificates. They were looking for the final pieces of Brett's financial armor to dismantle. Camille slid the key into the heavy steel box resting on the table. The internal mechanism turned with a heavy, satisfying thud. She lifted the lid. Inside, there were no financial documents. There was only a faded velvet pouch, a thick stack of handwritten letters bound by a brittle rubber band, and a sleek, silver external hard drive. Raj stepped forward, setting his briefcase on the table. He pulled out his slim laptop and booted it up in absolute silence, the screen casting a pale, bluish light across the mahogany surface. Camille handed him the drive without a word. The USB cable snapped into place. A moment later, a generic folder icon appeared on the desktop screen. Raj clicked it. The directory wasn't filled with financial spreadsheets or offshore shell company registrations. It was a chronological archive, sorted meticulously by year: 2011, 2012, 2013. Raj's hand hovered over the trackpad. A cold, sickening chill began to radiate from the center of his chest. He had married Stephanie in 2016. Camille had married Brett in 2015. He clicked on the folder marked 2012. A grid of high-resolution digital photographs populated the screen. He opened the first image. It was taken in a cramped, poorly lit college apartment, the paint peeling near the baseboards. Sitting on a cheap futon was a younger, scruffier Brett Gold. Straddling his lap, her face buried in his neck as she laughed at something off camera, was a 20-year-old Stephanie Moore. The silence in the vault became absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. Camille leaned closer to the screen, her breath catching sharply in her throat. She reached out with a trembling, manicured finger, tracing the digital timestamp in the corner of the image. This was 11 years ago. Raj rapidly clicked through the files. A trip to a snowy cabin in 2013, a shared, cheap grocery store birthday cake in 2014. And then, he found a subfolder labeled simply, The Transition. Inside was a scanned, handwritten letter on Stephanie's distinct floral stationery. Raj zoomed in, his dark eyes scanning the looping cursive script. I know it's hard, B, but we agreed. Raj is a safe bet. He's going to make senior partner by 30. He can give me the flawless, upper-class lifestyle I need to launch the PR firm. And Camille is your golden ticket into the Atherton circle. Her father's legacy connections will fund your VC firm. We just have to play our parts. 5 years, maybe 10. We build our empires on their dime, and then we take the exit strategy together. I love you. Raj slowly pulled his hand away from the keyboard. The air in the room felt impossibly thin, as if the vault had been entirely drained of oxygen. They hadn't been betrayed by a sudden, tragic loss of passion. They hadn't been the victims of a chaotic midlife crisis or a drunken mistake. It was so much worse. They were the business plan. Raj was the corporate ATM, providing the pristine suburban stability and limitless credit Stephanie needed to build her immaculate public image. Camille was the aristocratic stepping stone, the social key to the elite venture capital networks Brett could never have accessed with his middle-class background. They were never spouses. They were hosts. Brett and Stephanie were the parasites who had spent a decade feeding on their wealth, their time, and their youth, all while maintaining their own unbroken, subterranean romance. Camille staggered backward, the back of her knees hitting the leather chair. She sank into it, her hands covering her mouth, though no sound came out. The elegant, stoic woman was completely shattered, staring at the laptop screen as if looking at a monster in the dark. Raj reached out and closed the laptop. The sudden snap echoed violently against the steel walls of the vault. The sabotage they had just executed at the Seaside Inn suddenly felt like a child's game. This wasn't a broken marriage. This was a 10-year psychological heist, and it demanded an entirely different magnitude of destruction. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel was a masterclass in opulent illusion. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden light over 300 of Silicon Valley's most influential figures. The air hummed with the polite murmur of extreme wealth, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the soft, ambient notes of a live string quartet. Near the center of the room, Brett Gold stood in a bespoke tuxedo, laughing easily with a group of senior venture capitalists. Beside him, Stephanie Moore wore a stunning, floor-length emerald gown, her hand resting lightly on the arm of a prominent tech journalist. Despite the disastrous loss of the Vance account and the inexplicable freeze on Brett's offshore funds, they played their parts flawlessly. They were the picture of independent, soaring success, seamlessly navigating the elite social stratum they had spent a decade infiltrating. Standing in the shadows near the heavy velvet curtains of the terrace, Raj and Camille watched them. Camille wore a severe, high-necked black gown, devoid of her usual diamond jewelry. Raj stood beside her in a dark suit, his face entirely unreadable. There was no rage left in either of them, only the freezing, absolute clarity of an executioner. "They look invincible," Camille murmured, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the string quartet. "Illusion is their only currency," Raj replied softly. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his phone. It's time to bankrupt them. At precisely 9 o'clock, the gala chairwoman tapped her microphone, calling for the room's attention. The murmurs died down. Brett adjusted his cuffs, preparing to step up to the podium. He had paid $50,000 for a platinum sponsorship table, securing a 5-minute speech that he intended to use to pivot his firm's public image. He took his first step toward the stage. Suddenly, a low, synchronized vibration rippled through the ballroom. It started at the platinum tables near the front. A sharp ping, a buzz, then another. Within seconds, a wave of notification chimes swept across the room like a sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. Hundreds of smartphones lit up simultaneously in the dim lighting. Raj hadn't just sent an email. He had utilized an automated distribution list containing the private contact information of every gala attendee, board member, and press representative in the room. A list Stephanie had proudly compiled and left on their shared home network. The subject line was blank. The attachment was a single, high-resolution PDF file titled The Exit Strategy. Brett paused halfway to the podium, pulling his phone from his pocket with a frown of annoyance. Beside him, Stephanie opened her silver clutch to check her screen. Raj and Camille didn't look at their own phones. They kept their eyes locked on the center of the room. The silence that followed was not the respectful quiet of an audience awaiting a speech. It was a heavy, suffocating shock. Men in custom tuxedos stopped mid-sip, staring at their screens. Women covered their mouths, their eyes darting rapidly from the digital scans of the 2012 college photographs to the damning, handwritten lines of Stephanie's letter. "We build our empires on their dime, and then we take the exit strategy together." The shift in the room's energy was violent. The polite smiles evaporated, replaced by a collective, visceral revulsion. In the hyper-insular world of Atherton and Silicon Valley, affairs were occasionally tolerated as quiet scandals. But this was different. This was predatory. To be revealed as calculated, sociopathic grifters who had parasitically used beloved members of their own circle was the ultimate, unforgivable sin. Brett looked up from his screen, all the color draining from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. His eyes darted wildly around the room, meeting the gaze of his investors, his mentors, his peers. None of them looked away. They looked at him as if he were a contagion. Stephanie dropped her phone. The glass screen shattered against the marble floor, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent ballroom. She reached out toward the tech journalist she had been charming seconds ago, but the woman physically recoiled, taking a hard, deliberate step backward. The social quarantine was instantaneous and absolute. From the shadows of the terrace, Camille let out a slow, trembling breath. The empire was in ruins. The ghosts were dead. She turned her back on the ballroom, pushing open the heavy glass door to the cold night air, leaving Brett and Stephanie to drown in the absolute silence of their destruction. The underground parking garage of the Soma Executive Apartment Complex smelled faintly of damp concrete and motor oil. The harsh, fluorescent tube lights buzzed overhead, casting long, stark shadows between the concrete pillars. Raj walked toward his Audi, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous, empty space. He was exhausted, carrying a profound, heavy numbness in his chest that hadn't left since the night of the gala. He pressed the unlock button on his key fob. The headlights flashed. From the shadow of a neighboring concrete pillar, a figure stepped into the harsh light. Raj stopped. It was Stephanie, but the immaculate, terrifyingly poised PR executive who had dominated Silicon Valley boardrooms was entirely gone. She wore a wrinkled trench coat over plain dark clothes, her blonde hair unbrushed and damp from the San Francisco fog. Her face was pale, the dark circles under her eyes bruised and hollow. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had been completely exiled from her own life. She didn't approach him immediately. She stood a few feet away, her hands trembling visibly at her sides. "The security guard used to work at my old building," Stephanie said, her voice raspy, cracking on the first syllable. "He let me wait." Raj didn't reach for his door handle, but he didn't move toward her either. He stood perfectly still, his dark eyes resting on her with the cold, clinical detachment of a stranger. "I know I have no right to be here," she continued, the words spilling out of her in a frantic, desperate rush. She took a hesitant step forward. "But you have to listen to me, Raj. That letter, the business plan. It was 2012. We were kids, we were drowning in student debt, and Brett convinced me it was the only way. It was a stupid, sociopathic fantasy." She swallowed hard, tears finally spilling over her lower lashes, tracking through the faint remnants of yesterday's makeup. But it didn't stay a fantasy. The last 7 years, our marriage, our home. I didn't fake that. I stayed because I fell in love with the life we had. With you. I swear to God, Raj, it became real. It was the ultimate tragic irony. Even now, standing in the ruins of a life she had detonated, Stephanie was trying to spin the narrative. She was desperately pitching a revised version of history to the only client she had left to lose. Raj looked at her. He saw the subtle shake in her hands. He remembered how those hands used to fix his tie before major depositions, how they used to hold his coffee cup on Sunday mornings. For a decade, he had believed those small gestures were the foundation of a shared life. Now he understood they were simply the maintenance of an investment. He felt a sudden, violent urge rise in his throat, to scream, to shake her, to demand how she could sleep next to him for 3,000 nights while viewing him as nothing more than a corporate ATM. But he swallowed it down. Anger was a form of intimacy. It implied a lingering connection, a wound that still sought healing from the one who inflicted it. Apathy was the true opposite of love. Raj turned away from her and opened the driver's side door. "Say something!" Stephanie cried out, the professional composure completely shattering into a raw, ugly sob. She lunged forward, pressing her hands against the roof of the car. "Scream at me, Raj. Call me a monster. Tell me you hate me. Please, just say something." Raj slid into the leather seat. He didn't look at her through the open door. He pulled it shut with a heavy, definitive thud, cutting off her voice. He pushed the ignition button. The engine hummed to life. Through the glass, he watched Stephanie weeping, her hands slipping down the wet window as she begged for a closure he would never give her. He put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking space, leaving her standing alone in the toxic exhaust fumes of the underground garage. As Raj drove up the concrete ramp and merged into the gray, weeping traffic of the city, the silence inside the cabin was absolute. He had executed his revenge flawlessly. He had stripped her of everything. Yet, as he stared out at the rain-streaked windshield, he realized the terrifying truth. Destroying Stephanie had not returned the 10 years she had stolen from him. The victory was complete, and he had never felt so entirely empty in his life. The ink on Brett Gold's forced resignation letter was barely dry before the news hit the Silicon Valley business blogs. He had been unanimously ousted by his own board of directors, stripped of his equity, and quietly erased from the venture capital firm's website. There were rumors of an SEC audit regarding his offshore accounts. It was the final, definitive stroke of the demolition. Raj sat on the floor of his new, unfurnished apartment in Soma. The space smelled of fresh paint, ozone, and cardboard. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city was a blur of gray rain and bleeding brake lights. There was no champagne to pop, no triumphant toast, just the rhythmic, hollow drumming of the coastal rain against the heavy glass. A soft, hesitant knock echoed through the empty hallway. Raj stood up, his joints stiff, and walked to the door. When he opened it, Camille stood on the threshold. She wasn't wearing her usual immaculate cashmere or the defensive armor of her aristocratic upbringing. She wore a simple dark sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose tie. For the first time since he had met her under the harsh fluorescent lights of the gas station, she looked entirely unguarded and entirely exhausted. "The board pushed him out this morning," she said quietly, stepping into the apartment. Her footsteps sounded too loud in the empty space. "His accounts are officially under federal review. It's over." Raj closed the door, shutting out the cold draft from the corridor. "I saw the press release. Stephanie's firm filed for bankruptcy yesterday afternoon." Camille walked over to the windows, wrapping her arms around her own waist as she stared out at the sprawling, indifferent city. She had spent the last month running on pure, uncut adrenaline and the freezing fuel of vengeance. Every waking moment had been dedicated to the meticulous destruction of the man who had stolen a decade of her life. Now, with the target annihilated, the fuel was gone. Only the cold remained. "I thought I would feel lighter," Camille whispered, leaning her forehead against the cool pane of glass. "I thought watching him lose everything would somehow give me back the years he took. But it didn't. It just left a massive, terrifying hole." Raj walked up behind her, stopping a respectful distance away. He looked at the reflection of her pale face in the glass. He understood the profound, suffocating emptiness she was describing. For weeks, they had been perfectly aligned architects of destruction, but now, the building was demolished, the dust was settling, and they were just two people standing in an empty lot with no idea how to build a life from scratch. "Revenge is a transaction," Raj said, his voice low, devoid of any inflection of victory. "We paid for their ruin with the last pieces of our own sanity. The accounts are settled, but it doesn't make us whole." Camille turned around. The physical space between them felt both incredibly vast and dangerously narrow. Without the mutual enemy to bind them, the raw, complicated trauma bond they had forged in cheap motel rooms and dark cars was exposed to the harsh daylight. It was an intimacy built entirely on shared devastation. She looked up into his eyes, searching for an anchor in the wreckage. "What happens now, Raj? Who are we if we aren't the people they lied to, and we aren't the people who destroyed them?" Raj looked down at her hands, still tightly gripping her own elbows. He slowly reached out, his fingers gently covering hers, offering the only warmth he had left to give. It wasn't a promise of romance, nor a desperate attempt to fill the void with a new illusion. It was just the quiet, heavy acknowledgement of a fellow survivor. "I don't know," Raj answered honestly, the silence of the empty apartment pressing in around them. "But the war is over. Now, we have to learn how to live in the quiet." The wind coming off the Pacific Ocean at Half Moon Bay was brutal, carrying the sharp, stinging scent of salt and freezing sea spray. The sky above the jagged coastline was bruised with the dark purple and charcoal hues of twilight. It was a desolate, unforgiving landscape, entirely removed from the manicured lawns of Atherton and the glass towers of San Francisco. Raj stood near a rusted iron fire pit embedded in the sand, watching the flames crackle and spit against the damp evening air. He wore a heavy wool coat, his collar turned up against the chill. A few feet away, Camille stood perfectly still, her dark silhouette cutting a solitary figure against the crashing waves. Between them, resting on a piece of sun-bleached driftwood, was a heavy cardboard box. It contained the autopsy of their 20s and 30s. Camille stepped forward. She reached into the box and pulled out a stack of glossy wedding photographs. In the top image, she was smiling beneath a veil of French lace, holding onto the arm of a man who was already quietly calculating her net worth. She stared at the frozen, two-dimensional lie for a long moment. There was no tearful breakdown. The reservoir of her grief had been completely drained over the past month. With a steady, deliberate hand, she tossed the stack into the flames. The fire caught the edges of the heavy photo paper immediately. The chemical coating hissed, curling inward, turning the smiling faces of Brett and Camille into a blackened, bubbling mass before reducing them to ash. Raj reached into the box next. He bypassed the financial records they had already submitted to their respective divorce attorneys and picked up the faded velvet pouch. He opened the drawstring and pulled out the thick stack of college letters, bound by the brittle rubber band. The infamous 2012 business plan, the blueprint of their destruction, sat on top. He didn't read it again. The cursive loops were already permanently burned into his memory. He dropped the entire bundle into the center of the pit. The dry, aged paper ignited in a sudden, violent flare, casting a harsh, flickering light across his face. They stood side by side in silence, watching the fire consume the evidence of their betrayal. The heat radiated against their skin, a stark contrast to the freezing coastal wind. Finally, Raj pulled the sleek, silver external hard drive from his pocket. Fire wouldn't destroy the digital graveyard inside it. He looked at Camille. She met his gaze, giving a slow, barely perceptible nod. Raj turned toward the ocean. He walked to the edge of the surf, the freezing water rushing over the toes of his leather boots. With a sharp, forceful swing of his arm, he hurled the drive as far as he could into the churning black water. It disappeared beneath the whitecaps instantly, swallowed whole by the Pacific. When he walked back to the fire pit, the flames were already dying down, feeding on the last scraps of cardboard and memory. "It's gone," Raj said, his voice flat, carrying no triumphant note. "All of it," Camille agreed, her gaze fixed on the glowing embers. They lingered for another 20 minutes until the fire went out completely, leaving nothing but a pile of gray, smoking ash. They had survived the heist. They had executed the perfect retaliation. Yet, as they turned away from the pit, they didn't reach for each other's hands. There was a profound understanding between them, a bond forged in the darkest, most terrifying chapter of their lives, but it was not the foundation for a new romance. It was the shared silence of two soldiers who had survived a war and knew they could never return to the people they were before the first shot was fired. They walked back up the rocky dune toward the highway, where two separate cars were parked in the gravel lot. They didn't say goodbye. They simply got into their respective vehicles, turned on their headlights, and drove away in opposite directions, leaving the ashes of their past to be scattered by the cold, indifferent wind.